Components of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total spending on goods and services. AD is the total demand or the total spending in an economy over a period of time. So aggregate demand is made up of all the components that contribute to spending/demand in an economy. That is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Consumption and saving are affected by a number of factors. Now, before I go any further, I strongly suggest you read over my notes, because this video is a slightly watered down version of those notes. So let's go through these then. Consumption, sometimes referred to as consumer expenditure or consumer spending, is the total amount spent by households on goods and services. It doesn't include spending by firms. An increase in consumption will mean an increase in AD. A reduction in consumption will mean a reduction in AD. Consumption is the largest component of AD, about 65% of AD in the UK. This means that changes in the level of consumption will tend to have a huge impact on AD. Savings are made instead of consumption, so income can either be consumed or saved. When consumption is high, saving tends to be low, and vice versa. So let's look at the main factors affecting consumption and saving. The first one is income. So generally, as disposable income increases, consumption will rise. The rate at which consumption rises is usually lower than the rate at which income increases because households tend to save more as well. Second, interest rates. Higher interest rates tend to lead to less consumer spending. Consumers save more to take advantage of the higher rates, and they're less likely to borrow money or buy things on credit because it's more expensive. Consumers may also have less money to spend if interest rates on existing loans and mortgages increase. That is, they'll have less disposable income. Consumer confidence. When consumers feel more confident about the economy and their own financial situation, they spend more and save less. Confidence is affected by a number of factors. For example, in a recession, consumers are usually reluctant to spend because their confidence in the economy is low. For example, they might be worried about losing their jobs. This reluctance can continue even after a recession. Wealth effects. A rise in household wealth, for example, due to a rise in share prices or house prices, will often lead to a rise in consumer spending and a reduction in saving. That is, as the price of the asset goes up, consumers have more confidence, they go out and consume more. This is a positive wealth effect as opposed to a negative wealth effect when assets fall, consumers feel less confident and they consume less. Anyway, so let's return to the positive wealth effect. So a rise in household wealth, because the house has gone up in value, leads to more consumer spending and a reduction in saving. This is because the consumer's confidence has increased as the house price has risen faster than inflation. Therefore, homeowners will be more confident in their own finances. Taxes. Direct tax increases lead to a fall in consumers' disposable income, so they spend less. Indirect tax increases, for example VAT, increases the cost of spending, so consumers tend to reduce their consumption. A reduction in direct or indirect taxes will lead to an increase in consumer spending. It should be pointed out as well that indirect taxes shift the supply curve. SRAS for macro and S for micro. Unemployment. When unemployment rises, consumers tend to spend less and save more. People still in employment will tend to replace spending with saving as they now become worried about losing their jobs. A fall in unemployment means more people have money to spend, and consumers are less worried about losing their jobs, so consumer spending increases. So Don't confuse saving and investment. So reiterate, I have separate notes on savings and their determinants. But I'm going to just explain the difference now between saving and investment. It's important to realise that investment and savings are different things. Savings tend to be made by households, whereas investment tends to be made by firms. For example, savings made by a household might be money put into a savings bank account each month. An investment made by a firm could be money paid to build a new office. So investment is made by firms. Investment is money spent by firms on assets which they'll use to produce goods or services. This includes things such as machinery, computers, and offices. So they buy capital goods, man-made aids to production. So it's important to point out the difference between gross and net investment. Gross investment includes all investment spending. Net investment, however, only includes investment that increases productive capacity. In other words, if we are simply replacing existing stock because it's become outdated, that would not be included under net investment, but it would show up under gross investment. So let's give you an example. A firm has 3 old trucks, but replaces them with 5 new ones. The gross investment is 5 trucks, but the net investment would be 2. It should be pointed out that firms invest with the intention of making profit in the future. Investment in the UK is about 15% of AD. And here are the factors that affect investment. So the first one is risk. The level of risk involved will affect the amount of investment by firms. If there's a high risk that a firm won't benefit from investment, then it's unlikely that the firm will invest. For example, when there's economic instability, less investment will be made. Second determinant, government incentives and regulation. A government incentive such as subsidies or reductions in tax can affect the level of investment. For example, a reduction in corporation tax might encourage firms to invest because they'll have more funds available to do so. A relaxing of government regulations might reduce a firm's costs and make it more likely to invest. Interest rates and access to credit. Firms often borrow the money they want to invest. This means that when interest rates are high or firms are unable to access credit, i.e. they're unable to borrow money, investment tends to be lower. High interest rates would reduce how profitable an investment would be, since interest charges on loans will be higher. High interest rates will also mean there's a greater opportunity cost of investing existing funds instead of putting them into a bank account with a higher interest rate. Technical advances. Firms need to invest in new technology to stay competitive. Investment will rise when significant technological changes are made. At this point, I would like you to have a read over the accelerator process. So just have a Google of it. It's the idea that when an economy's GDP increases, there will be a surge in investment. In other words, investment will grow at a greater proportionate rate than the increase in GDP. So have a Google of that now, the accelerator effect. Finally, business confidence and animal spirits. The more confident a business is in its ability to make profits, the more money it's likely to invest. This is because demand for exports is high, but business confidence depends partly on the general optimism or pessimism of the company's managers. Keynes recognised that not all investment decisions are based purely on reason and rational thinking, and that human emotion, intuition, and gut instinct are also important factors. He called these factors animal spirits. Government spending. Government spending doesn't include transfers of money. The government spending component of aggregate demand is the money spent by the government on public goods and services, that is education, healthcare, defence and so forth. Only money that directly contributes to the output of the economy is included. This means transfers of money, such as benefits like job seekers allowance or pensions, are not included because there's no output produced in turn. Government spending is quite a large component of aggregate demand, so changes in government spending can have a big influence on aggregate demand. Government spending does not have to be equal to the revenue earned from tax, and you'll look at this in more detail when we look at fiscal policy. A government budget outlines a government's planned spending and revenue for the next year. Governments will usually have a budget deficit or a surplus. If a government spends more than its tax revenue it earns, it will be experiencing a budget deficit. Or if the government is spending less than the tax revenue it's earned, it will be experiencing a budget surplus. Governments use their fiscal policy, that's their taxation and their decisions and their spending, to influence aggregate demand. If aggregate demand is low and economic growth is slow or even negative, then a government may overspend. This is causing a budget deficit in order to increase aggregate demand and boost economic growth. If aggregate demand is high and the economy is experiencing a boom, a government might increase taxes and spend less, causing a budget surplus to try to reduce aggregate demand and slow down economic growth. An imbalance in the budget will affect the circular flow of income. A budget surplus will indicate an overall withdrawal from the circular flow, but a budget deficit will indicate an overall injection into the circular flow. An imbalance in the budget is fine in the short run. However, in the long run, governments will try to balance out any surpluses and deficits. A long-term surplus might mean the government is harming economic growth by choosing not to spend or by keeping taxes too high. A long-term deficit is likely to mean a country has a large national debt. Sometimes, governments will balance the budget so that government spending will be equal to revenue. This should have little effect on aggregate demand. An export from one country is always an import to another. Exports are goods or services that are produced in one country then sold in another. Imports are the opposite. They're goods and services that are brought into a country after being produced elsewhere. Exports are an inflow of money into a country, and imports are an outflow of money. So exports are an injection into the circular flow of income, and imports are a withdrawal. Exports minus imports, that's X minus M, make up the net exports component of aggregate demand. If the amount spent on imports exceeds the amount received from exports, as it does in the UK, net exports will be a negative number. There are many factors that will affect imports and exports. First, the exchange rate. Well, remember the acronym SPICE before we go any further. Strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear. A change in the value of currency will affect net export in different ways in the long and short run. In the long run, if the value of a currency increases, imports become relatively cheaper and exports become relatively more expensive for foreigners. As a result, demand for imports, that's M, rises and demand for exports falls. So a strong currency, that is a currency with a high value, will worsen net exports in the long run and reduce aggregate demand, but a weak currency will have the opposite effect and improve net exports. In the short run, demand for imports and exports tend to be quite price inelastic. For example, some goods don't have close substitutes, for instance oil, while others have might have substitutes, but there's a time lag before countries will switch to them. So in the short run, demand won't change much. This means that initially, when the value of a currency increases, net exports will actually improve, because the overall value of exports increases and the overall value of imports decreases. Changes in the state of the world economy. The higher a country's real income, the more it tends to import. So net exports fall as real income rises. The state of the world economy also affects exports and imports. For instance, the USA exports lots of goods to Canada. If Canada goes through a period of low or negative growth, then exports from the USA to Canada will decrease. Assuming imports are unaffected, this means a worsening in the USA's net exports. Similarly, if Canada experiences high rates of growth, exports from the USA are likely to increase, improving net exports from America. Degree of protectionism, such as tariffs and quotas. In the short run, tariffs and quotas can increase net exports by reducing imports. Remember, tariff is a tax on imports and quota is a physical limit on the number of goods being imported into a country. However, industries that are protected from international competition have few incentives to become more efficient, so will often export less in the long run. Also, in the long run, other countries may retaliate by introducing their own tariffs and quotas. Non-price factors. These include things such as the quality of goods. For example, advancements in technology in a country that lead to the production of higher quality goods would be likely to cause an increase in exports from that country, because people are willing to pay more for something if it's really good. This would mean an improvement in net exports. It should be pointed out that net exports tend to make up a small percentage of aggregate demand in the UK, so changes in net exports have a minor impact on AD.